Zsákutcam a postobot. Tudtam, hogy rossz felé megyünk.
Úgy értettem, a következő balra.
Elég a vitából. Csapdába estünk. Azonnal faroljon ki innen.
The bullet that killed an archduke travelled less than 5 feet. Gavrilo Princip was standing on the running board of a car that had already stalled, already reversed the wrong way, down a side street, already handed him a shot he had no right to get, and he still very nearly missed his moment entirely. Because by early afternoon, on the 28th of June, 1914, the plan he'd spent months preparing was already dead. Here's what actually happened that morning, because the sequence matters more than people remember. 6 conspirators were positioned along the Archduke's motorcade route through Sarajevo. The first one lost his nerve entirely and did nothing. The second, a young man named Nedeljko Chabrinovic, threw a grenade at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded back roof and detonated under the vehicle behind it, wounding a dozen people and sending Chabrinovic into the river in a botched suicide attempt that ended with him fished out alive by an unimpressed crowd. The motorcade sped up. The remaining conspirators, Princip among them, scattered through the city, convinced the mission had failed. Princip himself wandered off the planned route entirely and ended up outside a delicatessen on Franz Josef Street, not lying in ambush, not stalking his target, just standing there, resigned, possibly ordering something to eat. And then, the strangest piece of luck in the history of the 20th century happened. Archduke Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the people wounded in the earlier grenade attack at the hospital. Nobody told the driver the route had changed. The driver turned onto Franz Josef Street, the wrong street, was told he'd made a mistake and stopped the car to reverse. He stalled it directly in front of Gavrilo Princip. 2 shots, one through the Archduke's neck, one into his wife Sophie's abdomen, both dead within the hour. I want you to sit with how thin that is. A wrong turn, a stalled engine, a young man who'd already given up on the whole plan, standing exactly where the car needed him not to be. Historians call it one of the most consequential accidents in modern history, and they're not wrong to. But here's the question this video actually wants to ask, and it's a harder one than it sounds. What if the driver doesn't take that wrong turn? What if the car doesn't stall? Princip finishes his food, the Archduke rides out of Sarajevo very much alive, and the assassination that supposedly started the First World War simply never happens. Does the war still come? I want to be straight with you before we go any further, because this is the part most alternate history content skates past for the sake of a clean story. The assassination did not cause the First World War. It detonated it. Those are not the same thing, and the difference is going to carry this entire video. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a room already full of gas, sealed shut, waiting on a spark. Start with the alliance system, because it's the one people remember from school and mostly misunderstand. Germany and Austria-Hungary were bound together by treaty. France and Russia were bound together by treaty. Britain wasn't formally allied to France on paper the way the others were to their partners, but a decade of secret military planning between the British and French general staffs had made the obligation nearly as real as if it were signed. This wasn't a system built in June of 1914. It was built across 3 decades of European diplomacy, specifically designed to deter war by making any regional conflict instantly, automatically continental. The tragic irony is that the system built to prevent a general war was also the system guaranteed to cause one, the moment any single link in the chain got pulled. Then there's the military planning, and this is where things get genuinely chilling, because none of it depended on Sarajevo. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, the strategy for fighting France and Russia simultaneously, had been sitting in a drawer in Berlin since 1905. It assumed a 2-front war was close to inevitable, and it built an entire national strategy around beating France in 6 weeks before Russia's famously slow mobilization machine could bring its full weight to bear in the east. That's not a plan you draft because an archduke gets shot. That's a plan you draft because your general staff has already concluded the war is coming regardless, and the only variable left to control is timing. And the timing mattered enormously to Berlin for a reason that has nothing to do with Serbia at all. German planners were watching Russia's military modernization program, funded heavily by French loans, expand year over year. Their own intelligence told them that by 1916, certainly by 1917, the Russian army would be too large, too well equipped, too dangerous for the Schlieffen-Plan's timeline to work anymore. Historians call this the window of opportunity thesis, and it's one of the most persistent explanations for why the German High Command was willing to let a regional Balkan dispute escalate into a continental war rather than work to cool it down. That clock in Berlin was running with or without Gavrilo Princip, layer in the naval race next. Britain and Germany had spent the previous decade in a shipbuilding competition so consuming it earned its own name in the history books, the Anglo-German naval race, dreadnought for dreadnought, budget line for budget line, each country's parliament approving new battleships specifically to outpace the others. And underneath all of that, the armies of France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary had each expanded conscription in the years leading up to 1914, every single one of them justifying the expansion by pointing at what the others were doing. That's what makes an arms race so dangerous. Everyone's paranoia turns out to be accurate. Everyone is right that the others are preparing, which means everyone is also right to keep preparing themselves. There's no exit ramp built into that logic. It only runs in one direction. And then, underneath everything else, sits the Balkans, which had already produced 2 wars in the 2 years before Sarajevo. The First Balkan War in 1912, the second in 1913. Austria-Hungary watched Serbia emerge from both conflicts larger, more confident, and increasingly magnetic to the South Slavic populations living inside its own imperial borders. Vienna did not need Franz Ferdinand's blood to see Serbia as an existential threat. Vienna had wanted a pretext to crush Serbia since 1908, the year Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, and set off a decade of Serbian nationalist resentment that never once cooled down. So let's actually run the alternate timeline honestly, piece by piece, and see what survives without the assassination. The alliance structure doesn't dissolve. It's still there in July, still there in August, still binding the same capitals to the same obligations it always had. The naval race doesn't pause for a funeral that never happens. The 1914 shipbuilding programs in both Britain and Germany are already funded, already under construction, already scheduled for completion in 1915 and 1916, regardless of who's alive in Sarajevo. The Balkans do not go quiet because Serbia does not stop being, in Vienna's eyes, a state actively working to detach South Slavic territory from the empire. And Berlin's 6-week timeline to knock France out before Russia mobilizes doesn't get shelved just because one particular motorcade in Sarajevo goes off without incident. What you actually have without the assassination is the same room full of gas. You've just removed one specific match. Most historians who've spent their careers on this exact question arrive at roughly the same conclusion, and it's not the comforting one. The war probably still comes, maybe not in August 1914, maybe not over Serbia specifically as the immediate trigger, but the structural conditions that made a general European war likely weren't created by Gavrilo Princip standing outside a delicatessen, and they weren't going to be dismantled by his failing to fire 2 accurate shots. The historian Christopher Clark, in his study of the war's origins, described the leaders of Europe in 1914 as sleepwalkers, watchful but unseeing, haunted by dreams, yet blind to the reality of the horror they were about to bring into the world. That's a description of a system primed to detonate. It is not a description of a system that was waiting on one man's aim to survive. So let's walk the alternate path forward, country by country, and find out where the next spark was actually waiting. Start close to home, inside Austria-Hungary itself, because the internal problem doesn't go anywhere just because Franz Ferdinand lives. If anything, here's the genuinely strange irony sitting underneath this entire alternate history. Franz Ferdinand was one of the few senior figures in Vienna who actually favored a less confrontational approach to the empire's Slavic populations, an idea called trialism, restructuring the dual monarchy into a three-way partnership that gave South Slavs a formal political seat at the table instead of leaving them as subjects of a system built for Germans and Hungarians alone. Some historians argue that had he lived and eventually taken the throne, he might have pursued exactly the kind of internal reform that could have diffused Serbian nationalist sentiment over the following decade. The man Serbian nationalists killed may have been one of the only people in Vienna capable of neutralizing the grievance that got him killed. But in 1914, he wasn't emperor. Franz Josef was at 83 years old, and the Hawks, inside the Austro-Hungarian military command, had been agitating for war against Serbia for years, assassination or no assassination. General Konrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of the general staff, proposed a preventive war against Serbia more than 24 separate times between 1906 and 1914. He didn't need a dead archduke to want that war. He needed an excuse the rest of the government could accept, and one way or another, the Balkans were going to hand him one eventually. A border skirmish, an assassination of some lesser official, a diplomatic flashpoint over Albania, which was already an active friction point between Vienna and Belgrade in 1913. The match doesn't have to be Franz Ferdinand specifically. It just has to be something Vienna can point at. Move outward to Russia, whose entire posture in the real July crisis was built around one non-negotiable principle, that it could not allow Austria-Hungary to crush Serbia the way it had crushed Bosnian resistance in 1908 without losing all credibility as the protector of the Slavic world. That principle doesn't evaporate in this alternate timeline. It's sitting in St. Petersburg in 1915, in 1916, waiting for whichever crisis triggers it. And Russia had its own internal clock running too. The Tsarist government was pouring French loans into a massive army expansion program, the so-called Great Program, scheduled for completion around 1917. Some Russian generals actually welcomed the idea of a slightly later war once their own modernization had caught up. That's not a country drifting toward peace. That's a country counting down toward its own moment of maximum readiness on a schedule almost precisely opposite to Germany's. And that's before you even reach France, still nursing the loss of Alsace-Lorraine from the Franco-Prussian War 4 decades earlier, still building its entire foreign policy around eventually recovering that territory, still bound to Russia by a treaty specifically engineered to guarantee that any war against Germany would be fought on two fronts at once. French military planning, Plan 17, was itself an aggressive doctrine built around a rapid offensive into Alsace-Lorraine the moment war broke out. That plan existed independently of Serbia, independently of the Balkans, independently of anything happening in Sarajevo. It existed because French generals believed, correctly as it turned out, that a war with Germany was a matter of when, not if. Don't forget Italy either, nominally part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but harbouring its own territorial ambitions against Austria-Hungary in the Trentino and along the Adriatic coast. In our real timeline, Italy stayed out of the war for nearly a year and then switched sides entirely, joining Britain, France and Russia in 1915 in exchange for promised territory. That calculation, that Italy's actual interests ran against its own alliance partner, was already visible to observers in Rome well before 1914. It didn't need an assassination to exist. It only needed a war, any war, to be tested. And sitting at the edge of all of it, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, hemorrhaging territory after the Balkan Wars, watching Russia eye the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles the way it had for a century, looking for a great power patron strong enough to guarantee its survival. Germany had spent years cultivating exactly that relationship, training Ottoman officers, financing Ottoman railways, positioning itself as the empire's protector against Russian ambition. That alignment, too, existed before Sarajevo and would have existed after it. So picture the alternate autumn of 1914, No assassination, no July crisis over Serbia. The Archduke rides home from Sarajevo, eventually ascends the throne, and Europe keeps sitting in that same sealed room, still full of gas, still waiting. Maybe the spark comes from Albania in 1915, another flare-up in a region that had already produced 2 wars in 2 years. Maybe Hutzendorf finally gets his preventive war against Serbia in 1916 over some other pretext, and Germany, watching its window against Russia close a little further with every passing month, decides this is the moment to back Vienna completely. Maybe it isn't the Balkans at all. Maybe it's a colonial dispute, the kind that had already nearly triggered a European war twice before over Morocco, once in 1905 and again in 1911, both times defused at the last possible minute by a diplomacy that grew visibly less reliable each time it was tested. Maybe it's a naval incident in the North Sea, a miscalculation between British and German patrol vessels during a routine exercise, the kind of near collision that actually happened more than once in those years without escalating purely by luck. Here's the version of this alternate history that should actually unsettle you. It isn't one where the war doesn't happen. It's one where it happens 2 years later in 1916, fought with weapons technology that had continued maturing in the interim. Machine gun doctrine, artillery ranging, early military aviation, all of it was still developing rapidly between 1914 and 1916 in our actual timeline. A war that starts 2 years later doesn't necessarily start smaller. It could start considerably worse, fought by armies that have had 2 additional years to build precisely the killing machines that made the real First World War the catastrophe it became. Russia's great program would be complete or nearly complete by then, meaning the Eastern Front alone could open with a far larger, far better equipped Russian army than the one that actually invaded East Prussia in August 1914. Germany, aware of exactly that risk, would have every incentive to force the confrontation earlier rather than let that window close entirely, which only adds pressure toward a war breaking out sooner rather than later, regardless of what happens in Sarajevo. There is a minority argument worth taking seriously here too, because good history doesn't pretend the case is closed. Some historians argue that without the specific emotional charge of a royal assassination, without Austria-Hungary carrying a personal, almost vendetta-shaped grievance against Serbia in particular, the diplomatic crisis that does eventually erupt might have been managed more cautiously, might have stayed regional, might not have activated the full chain of alliance obligations the way the real July crisis did in 1914. But it asks you to believe that 4 or 5 major powers, all of whom had spent a decade building armies, fleets, and mobilization timetables premised on an eventual continental war, would have kept finding reasons to step back from every single spark indefinitely, forever, without exception. Sooner or later, one of those sparks was always going to catch, because unlike Gavrilo Princip standing outside a delicatessen on Franz Josef Street, the underlying conditions of 1914 Europe never had to get lucky. They only had to wait. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, because it's the part that makes this alternate history genuinely tragic rather than just academically interesting. In our real timeline, the war that followed killed somewhere around 17 million people and wounded 20 million more, and it did so partly because it arrived as a surprise to populations and governments who believed right up until the last week of July 1914 that the crisis would be contained the way the last several had been. An alternate timeline where the eventual war arrives in 1916 instead, after 2 more years of exactly this same arms build-up, this same alliance hardening, this same great power paranoia compounding on itself, isn't obviously a kinder timeline. It might just be the same detonation with a longer fuse and a bigger charge behind it. And there's a darker possibility still worth naming. A war that starts in 1916 rather than 1914 potentially draws in an America that has had 2 additional years to watch European militarism escalate, 2 additional years of German submarine doctrine to mature, 2 additional years for public opinion in Washington to harden in one direction or another before the first shot is even fired. The timeline shifts, the shape of the war might shift with it, but the war itself, in nearly every serious historical reconstruction of this scenario, does not simply disappear. So no, Gavrilo Princip missing his shot on the 28th of June 1914 does not save the 20th century. It probably delays it. It might reshape exactly which countries go to war against which, over what specific pretext, in what specific month. It might even change who eventually wins. But the room stayed full of gas either way, and the real tragedy of that summer was never truly about one motorcade taking a wrong turn down one street in Sarajevo. It was about a continent that had spent the better part of a decade building the exact conditions for its own detonation and was simply waiting to find out which match would finally do it. If you like this kind of video, the near misses and the turning points that almost didn't happen, check out the rest of the channel. There's more like it.